All right, now let's have some insight into what's made the news. Start with a story about the World Bank urging the Central Bank of Nigeria to ensure sustainable inflation control measures. Inflation rate as of December 2024 was put at about 34.8%, and now the CBN, the World Bank rather, is urging the CBN to ensure that it has inflation control measures. Now, the CBN, in the course of the year 2024, had about 6 Monetary Policy Committee meeting, MPC meeting. That's a forum where they talk about measures to control inflation and other, they adjust other indices that could help the economy. So at that point, the monetary policy rate, MPR, or if you like, the interest rate was raised from about 18.75% to 27.25%, which it's still at right now. And those increases were done with a bid to tackle inflation. But we've seen that the inflation in Nigeria has defied the measures that the CBN has employed so far. So if the World Bank is urging the CBN right now to ensure inflation control measures, what more can be done? Let's take a look at that this morning. I pass the ball now to Dr. Idahosa Osamhanze.
Well, I think I'm always on the other side of the divide with CBN. I am World Bank or the Bretton Woods institutions when it comes to the issue of managing the economy, especially those of third world. And these are the challenges that Africans had faced over the years. Because when you're prescribing something for somebody, what you're doing is you're using your problem to define another person's problem. What's responsible for inflation in Nigeria at the moment? What's driving inflation? And I think those are the issues that first and foremost we have to look at. That against what CBN believes is the driver of inflation, which is demand. In which case, people have so much money and there is so few goods to buy, and their prices are on the rooftop. But that is not the exact case in Nigeria as we speak. The inflation in Nigeria is cost push. Cost of production is on the roof because of 3 important factors. Exchange rate hike. We have subsidy removal from electricity and subsidy removal from energy, petrol and diesel. And most factories that are here run on this. Transportation and logistics is on this. And so it's not as Nigerians are having more money and therefore there's a need to remove money from their hands so that we can manage the urge to buy. As we all know, and World Bank should also come here to get around the street to know that many people don't even have this money to spend. So if you're asking CBN, because we are preparing for the next MPC meeting to sustain what you're doing, which means you're saying to them, again, increase the MPR, which of course, what does that mean? Make loan procurement in Nigeria more expensive. Now, for us as lay people, we understand that if a man is borrowing money at a very expensive cost, then of course the cost of the loan, he will factor as part of the input into production, which of course will make prices more high. And that will drive inflation up. So I think these are the things that should be looked into. That if we have to address the problem of inflation right here in Nigeria, is not about raising rates. It's about finding ways for us as a people to reduce rates so that the borrowing cost is reduced and we can become competitive like every other part of the world. You know, this is what World Bank should help us do, really. Not telling us that we need to curb inflation by increasing rates and take money off circulation, because it's not every Nigerian that actually has access to this money. Money is only in the hands of the few. And most of these monies, you don't circulate. So driving down inflation in Nigeria is how do we increase productivity, for example, so that people can have money? How do we empower company, for example, to make more profits so that, of course, staffs can have more money in their hands and then people can do more businesses and then the environment flourishes. So the problem is really not about people having too much money. The problem is about people not having money and the prices are on the rooftop.
I wonder what the next NPC meeting would actually focus on, because we saw a steady increase from one NPC meeting to the other in the course of last year, and the CBN had this belief that it's only by increasing the interest rate that it would be able to control inflation. I've often wondered about the efficacy of some textbook principles, because we've seen that some of these principles don't always work, and it's not a one-size-fits-all anymore. Because, like you've said, Doctor, what works in a particular region may not work in the other, because the issues are different. And I don't think that up to now the CBN has actually acknowledged that. Otherwise, the measure it's been employing, it would know that this measure would not give the right result. Increasing the interest rate steadily from 18% to about 27% has even, in my opinion, further stifled the economy, because it's hard for businesses. But we talked about the role that microfinance institutions played last year, being able to give loans to most people who were creditors, who needed loans from banks. We found that even at that, the rate of those that were able to secure loans reduced. There was a decline in that, because some people will consider the cost of the loan and just make do whatever they have. Yes, they can transfer the cost, but sometimes it even make them being able to have sales or make sales very difficult, especially when what they offer, the products or services that they offer, is something that people can actually forego. So they just feel like, well, this is a time for me to make my decision. So what can I forego? So the issue, the principle of opportunity cost comes in. So if your product has a substitute and it's become very expensive, chances are you will make less sales because less people are having demand for it. So it's made the economy more difficult. So I'm hoping that the next NPC meeting that the CBN would be having, some of these principles that have been used over the years, that we're now seeing new conditions, new economic conditions that have defined them, would be reviewed and more practical steps should be taken.
Totally agree with your submission, Blessing, and that of doctors. When I say we, both Nigeria and, a section of the global economy, weren't particularly expecting the CBN to go the bullish stance in the last two MPC meetings, especially the last one in November, I reckon, where it went from 27.25 to 27.50, which, they did with the intention of curbing inflation and driving, it farther down. But, like Doctor said, there are the key drivers of this very, very disturbing, trend of inflation, upward trend of inflation, which they aren't particularly focusing on. But, just essentially thinking that it's a one-size-fits-all measure, that once it's like a binary switch. You turn it off, you turn it on, and everything is fine. I think they have been, I would say, doing the right thing, but not enough of it, so to speak. Again, I speak from the perspective of someone who is not in the CBN and doesn't exactly know firsthand how, they operate. But, having heard from experts both at the top level and mid-level, they're all saying the same thing, that the CBN is going in the right direction, but there's still some things that they aren't particularly covering. But let's step away from the CBN just for a little bit. We're going to come back. Doctor spoke about production. We seem to have been focusing too much on what the CBN is or is not doing, but then that's on the monetary side. How about the fiscal side? We're leaving out the economic handlers, or the economy handlers in this case, right? There is such a thing as, curbing our excessive borrowing, which also Doctor made an allusion to. So if you have the, economic handlers doing their best, let me put it that way, doing their best to, mop up revenue in the public service, yeah? What that means is it's generate enough revenue, which is, channeled back or plowed back to government coffers, and it's channeled into funding essential services, right? That would, raise revenue essentially, or that would shore up revenue, so to speak, and then prevent needless and excessive borrowing in the system. Then circling back to the CBN, collaborating with the government to make sure that there is enough investment with said revenue raised in critical infrastructure that would help shore up the supply side or supply chain, or rather, let me rephrase that would help clear out bottlenecks, if you like, in the supply chain, yeah, and boost productivity. Now, that process essentially will save us a mountain of trouble, because those are the things that essentially drive inflation. So if that happens, then I think we may or may not be, well, let me rephrase that, we may be closer than we think we could possibly be to, curbing all of this. Because if you
but look at it this way. A certain congressman says the problem in Africa is not that Africa need more money to borrow, but that the Bretton Woods institutions have placed Africa in a certain position where we are consistently trying to demonstrate to the Bretton Woods institutions that we have capacity to borrow and pay back. And what that had done in Africa is that it has taken lending rate to the rooftop and taxes to the rooftop. So we are taxing poverty in Africa. And he said, as long as we remain in that circle, we will never get out. And so Africa is in a debt trap, because you have to prove to your creditor that you have capacity to pay what you have borrowed. And to be able to do this, so you have to be hard on your people, trying to generate revenue so that you can meet your debt obligations. So as Africans are investing in servicing of their debt, which of course at a certain point in Nigeria, we were doing with 100% of our revenue. So what's government doing? They come from all manner of guises to impose tax on the people who are already overburdened by poverty. Proving this point. And I think Oyedele made this point sometime last week while he spoke. And he said that let's be frank with ourselves and be realistic to actually look at what the problems are on the surface. That the problem is not as CBN seems to be assuming that are responsible. There are two critical factors that we must have to pinpoint as responsible for the growing inflation rate in Nigeria. And he said, first, the greed of the elite, who are buying dollars that they don't need. And that has consistently put pressure on the forex market, that Nigerians are stocking dollars, and like it has become like a habit that people have money, they just go buy dollars and keep, but they don't need the dollars. And therefore, that creates a pressure on the FS market, which is driving the cost of dollar up, and as the cost of dollar is going up, the cost of purchases also go up with it, and everything that's associated, which is calculated as inflation. So if we want to deal with inflation, he says, what we really need to do is to say, how do we stop accumulating dollars? That's from the side of the elite. And then secondly, reduce the rate of borrowing, which is on the rooftop, because if America is talking about inflation rate at 2%, and borrowing in America is single digits, borrowing in Asia is single digits, borrowing in Middle East single digits, why is it that it's only in Africa that borrowing has to be 2 digits?
You know, the question you asked now, sometimes when we analyze these issues, or even when those who have the responsibility to attend to economic issues on behalf of the country are handling this, they make comparison between Africa or Nigeria and other climes without actually basing those comparisons appropriately. So,
on realities
on
of both
realities,
countries.
when it's time to tax Nigerians, you hear them say, oh, in the US, this is the level of taxes citizens pay. In this country, that country, this is the level of taxes they pay. But they don't base it on the earning power of the people. I said that to say this. If we understand that the situations are not same, perhaps this copy and paste policy, type of policy that we do, we will be careful with it. Now, we've talked about what the CBN has been doing and how it's not been working, how the economy is heavily dollarized. Now, while there is an implication of dollarizing the economy, further increasing inflation, there is a thought out there, or the school of thought out there, that to save yourself or to safeguard your earnings and your savings, you need to denominate them in dollars. You need to save in dollars so that regardless of the inflation rate, you will still have the value of the money. And that too is making the demand for dollars increase, further increasing inflation, because we are still largely an import-dependent nation. So when dollar prices increases, it means that when the importers want to purchase, they buy at a higher rate, and then they sell at a higher rate, further increasing inflation. We also have the food components of it, because food inflation is even the highest and is a large contributor to the overall inflation. We have issues of insecurity that has further reduced the productivity from the agricultural sector. We have issues such as infrastructure issues. Some of them are unable to bring their produce to the market. A lot of issues contribute to the inflation in Nigeria. We also have on the part of the business people, sometimes artificial scarcity of certain products. All of this put together results in the inflation rate that we're seeing. So if the CBN wants, not just the CBN, it's not just for the CBN, it's also for the federal government when policies are being made, so that the CBN is not making one policy and there is a counter policy being made that is further making things difficult. Well, if we talk about the removal of subsidy, we cannot talk about the timing being more right, because at some point it still would have been done. But what about the removal of electricity subsidy? That also increased electricity tariff. So there are different policies that have been made by government that have also in one way or the other contributed to the inflation rate in the country. A lot needs to be done. The CBN can do their own part by ensuring that inflation, the interest rate comes down by the next meeting. Well, it may not come down to 18% because that may just be drastic, but at least let it come down to a level that business people can afford. The government on its own, when policies are being made, whether on taxation, but I think the federal government may have been able to handle the issue of taxation through the new tax bill if that is passed. But some other policies that are being made should ensure that it is in tandem. There is some synergy between what the CBN is doing and what the government is doing to ensure that inflation is controlled. For those farmers, we need to handle this issue of insecurity, because we cannot over preach about it. If the cost of food comes down, then significantly inflation rate would also drop.
Please, listen, David, just to put it, it's important. You see, people talk about this security movement in Nigeria as responsible for the hike in price of food. I really don't subscribe. You know why?
Why?
Let me give you two instances. When I was in school, my school fees as undergraduate was 360 naira. My mother don't need to sell a basin of fried cassava to pay that. Now, in that same school where I was taking 360 as school fees, the current school fees is about 250,000. And if my mother was still alive to fry gari to pay for that, he would do like about 20 basins to be able to get it if he was selling at that same old price. What is driving the prices of food up is the fact that these farmers who are bringing this food to the market, they also having services that they are subscribing to. And they need the money from the farm produce to be able to look at it. For example, rice is selling, one bag of rice is 100,000. So the man who is selling gari is struggling to see that me, I can sell 2 kg of gari to be able to buy one bag of rice. If you understand the principle of barter, that is what it is. So many of the challenges that we face, especially with food prices, is because prices of other things, which of course you have alluded to very correctly, arising from the increase in electricity prices, increase in petrol prices, increase in diesel prices. So these farmers would definitely have to put money, because some 5 years ago, if you are taking a truckload from Kebbi to Lagos, it's about 30 to 40,000. Today, if you want to take that same truckload, it's about 100,000. Now, are you expecting that farmer will just throw their yam or rice inside the truck and come to disperse it in Lagos for free? It will not happen. So it is this effect of all the rises in the prices, which is of course inflation, that we call food inflation, is as responsible for the is derivable from what the FS is doing to other products, especially when we say we are an import dependent economy, including tomatoes paste, which we have to buy that we cannot produce from our farms.
In summary, before we go to the next story, I just think the government right now needs to take a multifaceted approach, as opposed to, having this tunnel vision approach that they've had, just looking in one direction, or if you like, a unilateral or unidimensional, approach. Having a lot more broader view on, or taking a lot more broader view on what the dysfunctions are in the economy. We've said it all. We've talked about the key drivers, which is food inflation and core inflation, which doesn't particularly factor, energy and food in the mix, and is not particularly measured by the CPI. So, putting all of these together, I think there's a very critical need to focus more on some of these things that they're not really focusing on, as opposed to taking the, persistent approach that they have taken, because it hasn't particularly gotten us anywhere. So there's need for a more intentionally multifaceted approach to tackling inflation in the country.